Higher education unionization is experiencing unprecedented popularity, particularly among graduate student workers, creating new challenges and opportunities for institutions across the country. Today, we'll explore this rapidly evolving landscape with Jennifer Kulbeck, Assistant Provost at St. Mary's College of California, who brings a decade of experience working with faculty unions, and Matt Cipriano, Associate Dean at Mount Sinai's Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences, who recently navigated conversations of a new graduate student union. Together, they'll share insights on maintaining productive relationships while balancing institutional needs in this transformative moment for academic labor relations. Jen, Matt, I'm so psyched about this. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Ray. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ray.
In full disclosure, as we're getting started, I am a member of ACT UAW Local 7902 as an adjunct faculty member at New York University. And I'm also a supporter of what's going on right now at University of Southern California, where UAW is working to unionize the faculty there. So I have some vested interest here in unionization, but I'd love to just sort of dive in and maybe start with you, Jen, given you've been working with faculty unions for a long time. What do you see as some of the most significant changes you're observing right now at this inflection point in higher education labor relations? And then, Matt, I'd love to hear how you see that comparing to the work you've been doing in graduate student unionization.
Yeah, well, I could kind of set a stage more nationally and globally on the topic. My experience over the years has really been with the faculty union at St. Mary's College and just trying to stay abreast of and be attentive to what's going on in the campus labor movement broadly across the US. There is a center at Hunter College, CUNY Hunter College. It's the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions. And they recently came out with a study like early 2024 that talks a lot about the campus labor movement. So I thought it would be helpful to just kind of anchor some of our facts in some things from their recent report that I find really interesting. So like in the last dozen years, from 2012 to 2024, a huge growth in unionization has happened in higher education. Faculty, whether that's part-time per course adjunct faculty or graduate student instructor unionization has really increased. Now, among faculty, I'm just reading from their report, it's gone up from about like 374,000 members to about 402,000 members. So like a seven something percent increase among faculty, but among graduate students, it's gone from like 64,000 in 2012 to more than 150,000 in 2024.
Wow.
So that's like, oh boy.
Yeah.
So I feel like the kind of surge and growth in campus labor movement has really happened on the student side. And that's also where you see the media is really interested. And so that often is a lot of the stories that hit like a general regular outside of higher ed news feed as well. In my personal experience at working with faculty, things have gone internally from, oh boy, we have a union, no one knows what that means, to, oh yeah, we understand what that means. So now how do we like do a good job at doing that? That's the trend that I've seen in my community here. And that's been an interesting one. But before I try to unpack any of that, I don't know, Matt, you've been at the heart of a lot of the big growth area.
Certainly. At Mount Sinai in 2022, our postdocs, which are part of the grad school population, they voted to unionize, and we went through negotiations with them throughout 2023, reaching a collective bargaining agreement in December of 2023. Then on the tails of that, our students, our graduate students in our PhD program voted to also proceed with unionization. They submitted and voted to unionize this past October. However, they actually withdrew their request for unionization in January of this year and have stepped back from that. On the heels of all this, we're also seeing our junior research population joining together and signing union cards to petition to have their opportunity to form a union as well. So there is still much union activity going on our campus. We do have our active postdoc union right now. And just recently, as I mentioned, our students withdrew their position.
That's interesting. And I mean, looking at this, the National Labor Relations Board kind of greenlit this like 20 years ago. I think it was Brown University, where graduate students in particular were unionizing, and now you see it all over the place, not just faculty, but like student athletes unionizing. It sounds to me from what you've both shared that your campus communities and administration were more open to these conversations than potentially others have been. There are cases where provosts and academic leaders and administrative leaders come out, and it's not union busting, but they're definitely giving out information that discourages joining a union, whether it's for students or faculty. So I'm just curious if you could both share a little bit about some of the administrative complexities you've gone through with these unionization efforts. Is it just sort of like a no-brainer, like we have to do this, they're going to unionize, or is there a hesitancy, and where might that come from?
I think there's certainly a fear of unionization as a whole. Not so much from the unionizing populations, but from those of us who are in positions that we work with the union. There are a lot, especially in higher education, there are a lot of unknowns as to where the union will be impactful and what role they will serve. And often the collective bargaining agreements will limit the actions that administrators could take beforehand or how they could proceed things and provide very specific courses of action or recourses for how to address topics. That can sometimes tie our hands in unexpected ways. It also can provide new pathways for addressing different issues. I think there's always a fear of change when it is so sudden and immediate, and addressing that is part of this. And then certainly in the idea of what unionizations represent, whether we actually want that on campus or not. So campuses, regardless of their desire to work with unions or how they work with unions once they're there, may often seem hesitant to enter into the unionization process and push back on it as well.
Yeah, I would just add to that by saying like collective bargaining relationships between academic employees and the institutions are relationships. And so I think generally, if there's, an administration of a college thinks that they have good relationships with their employees of all kinds, and then a collective bargaining type relationship is initiated, and it kind of can feel like a wedge in between what would otherwise be just a regular relationship, at least perceived that way. In some cases, it can improve processes that affect the, campus employees positively. In the end, it can call to question university record keeping, transparency of information, treating similar people and similar types of employees in the same way as one another. It can eliminate things like subjectivity or inconsistent treatment of people in the same groups. But I do think there's a natural hesitation to have a collective bargaining agreement be between the direct relationship between an institution and a group of employees. So I think it's complicated by that relationship piece.
I think another part of this is that it often feels contentious. You're sitting on the opposite side of the table from the union when you're negotiating, and it often becomes an us versus them mentality on both sides of the situation. And it's easy to lose sight that what we all want, both those unionizing as well as those in the management side, are the best experiences and environments for our stakeholders to work within or be within. And it's hard, it can be easy to lose track of that when you're presenting two sides of the same coin and have different ideas about how to proceed. So it often feels more contentious than it needs to be, and can often lead to some tensions between the two sides.
Yeah, Matt, like even the vocabulary or like the shorthand will be like, well, from our side of the table, it looks like this, or from your side of the table. And that just sets you up on opposite sides of a conversation instead of when oftentimes you're agreeing, there's an adversarial like positionality, adversarial vocabulary that's just commonly used in most settings.
Absolutely.
That adversarial relationship was kind of what was on my mind as you were talking. The idea that it's an us versus them with a, shared mutual destruction at the end of it all. My family had a business which was unionized, and there were financial pressures on that business that prevented certain upkeep. And as a result of that, the union came in and applied pressure to the point where that business closed and went into bankruptcy. And it was very easy to sit on one side of that as, a family business and say, they're going to push us out of business. They don't understand the financial pressures we're under, versus the employees and the union, where I'm sure they were thinking we're being taken advantage of. they have money, they're not giving us our due, we need to fight for it, and if that means the end of this business, so be it. I don't think the members of the union feel that way. I think the union felt that way because they want to win that. But it is interesting when you're negotiating there, depending on what side of the table you're on, Jen, you look at that collective bargaining agreement a little differently. So, just from your experiences, first time I ever saw a collective bargaining agreement was when the students at NYU unionized, and I looked at it and I thought some of it was outlandish. Like, I didn't know that graduate students can have dental insurance. I didn't have dental insurance in my PhD program, but they were guaranteed that in that collective bargaining agreement. So, what would you say are some of the key competencies? You kind of already talked about like not making it adversarial, but what other things should higher ed administrators develop to see that either from a faculty perspective or Matt, from a student perspective?
A part of my work related to the collective bargaining agreement at my institution is just ongoing resourcing and training for anyone working with any employees who are represented by the union. And sometimes the idea of like how you might do a thing if you are not consulting the agreement is in direct conflict with what the agreement dictates as the exact way to proceed. In our agreement, seniority for course assignments is super strong and really at the center of work opportunity. And sometimes I think our faculty forget that that applies in all instances. Even if you're having a special summer thing for this group, if it's a credit bearing course, these rules still apply. And so I often have to just do some education intervention when I'm hearing about anomalous situations or, oh, but that's a pilot project. I thought that the rules would just be set aside for that. Well, and there are a lot of people who work at a college, and there's a lot of decentralized decision making around staffing courses. And so I think higher ed has a unique decentralized kind of authority and need for training on a regular basis. On the flip side of that is the positive side around performance evaluation and performance feedback as an obligation of the institution for the faculty member as well. That's an investment of time that's also dictated by our agreement. So not just controlling access to work, but also compelled feedback on that work. From a student perspective, though, I bet it looks a lot different.
I think especially as an administrator, it's really worth remembering that there's a reason the students felt a need to join together and unionize. We have a unique perspective as administrators about how our programs are doing and making sure we are addressing the needs of our students. And we have ideas as to what we think the best way to do this are. And those ideas can differ from what the student populations are. They can be dated, they can be based on different information. We just came out of a 3-year pandemic, which really changed the rules of how we engage with each other and operate on a day-to-day basis across all of business as well as higher ed. And even the socialization within education that occurs from in-person meetings and having the opportunity to engage in an in-person presence was lost during that time. And a lot of the conversations that occur naturally and organically weren't occurring. Are we still as attuned with the student experience as we think we are? And if the students felt a need to unionize, if the students felt that some of their needs weren't being addressed from what the administration was doing, we should be opening our ears to see what those are. We're not always going to agree 100%. We're not always going to agree 50% on what these issues are. But understanding that the students see these as a problem that they're facing in their student experience is important for us to remember.
It's interesting when you're on the inside looking out. Sometimes things seem very straightforward, but when you're in one of those communities, student community, faculty community, there are other issues that come up or it's not as clear. For example, as a faculty member, I see things come through all the time about disagreements during the collective bargaining negotiation process. And the way they're characterized are put to me in ways that make sense. But then as someone who was an administrator at the school, I can see how what's being asked could be burdensome. And it just shows me how difficult it is to maintain a positive working relationship between union representatives and those representing the institution's interests. So how do you balance that? How have you seen that balanced? Where, I mean, you clearly have to be a negotiator. You can't get angry every time somebody does something, but how do you effectively represent your institution's interests during negotiations?
I think that's a difficult question, and especially difficult to not bring your own biases, opinions, passions into the conversation. I think when you are at the table and you're presenting your side of the argument, you very much think that this is the right way to move forward with this side of the argument, or this side of the conversation or discussion or point that you can't come to terms with. It gets very difficult to hear the other side's opinions and thoughts on this when you feel your side is so right, which often makes and leads to those contentious situations. We are pushing forward what we believe is the right path forward. There's certainly room for negotiation and compromise on that, as there is on both sides. But there are also some points where people want to set their feet in, and it makes it much more difficult to find those compromises. And a lot more personal opinions, I think, get embodied in those conversations than the things people don't have as much vested in.
I agree totally. And what you were saying earlier, Matt, rings true here. Like remembering that there's a unionized environment for a reason and really trying to lean in compassionately toward that is my position. I try to come to each kind of negotiation point with clarity on why our proposal is shaped as it is from an institutional perspective, but totally open to understanding what the other side of the table is thinking on the same issue. Like, why is the request? We've had a couple of really interesting and clarifying moments over the years where we've come to the table on something, and after conversation and asking questions, it's come clear that it was just a fundamental misunderstanding and something new doesn't need to be negotiated. But the perception and the amount of information available to flow back and forth was limited previously. So just like hearing from one another ends up really being a good way to develop and maintain a good working relationship, but also it can sometimes resolve points of conflict in a negotiation.
I think something else to remember in a lot of these situations, especially with student unionization or postdoc unionization, even faculty unionization in part, is that the workers within these unions aren't your traditional workers. These are not people who necessarily have your traditional 9 to 5 or set hour jobs. These are not necessarily jobs that have defined locations for work or specifics as to what's being worked on. And applying union terminology to that can be difficult. But then on top of that, a lot of the managers who are on the opposite side of this are faculty members in our case. They're faculty members and mentors working with the students. They're not your traditional office managers or foremen or management positions that you would typically see. So understanding on both the student worker or postdoc worker's part, as well as the faculty manager's part, is something that both sides need to learn what their role actually is, what the CBA spells out for them, and how they fit into this bigger picture. Jen, as you mentioned before, you've had a number of faculty members questioning whether this applies to them or not because of their little program here or there. And understanding that this applies across the board is something that we are starting to build into how we conduct our business.
So, as we've talked about, this is an accelerating and growing trend. And not every campus is unionized, but these conversations are happening everywhere for both graduate students, postdoctoral students, and faculty. If you were advising another higher education leader at another institution where maybe this isn't happening yet, or it might just be starting, what would you advise them to be looking out for? Like, what trends do you see emerging in this higher education unionization world? With the rise of graduate student unions and with faculty unionization, how can they prepare for these changes? What can they do to ensure that they're ready when these conversations happen?
Update their resume and look at job posting boards so they can find new places to go to. You could edit that one out.
No, I want to keep that in. That's always a good piece of advice in uncertain times. But beyond leaving their institution, which is an option, what would you say they could learn, or what could they be more educated about to help them navigate these conversations?
Well, Matt, I'm thinking about some of our conversations over the last year where just institutional record keeping is something that if you suddenly find yourself in an initial negotiation or initial unionization environment and there are requests for information flying across the table in both directions, you will quickly learn all of your data gaps as an institution because it becomes difficult to produce things in an efficient and quick way that you then need to put systems in place to track so that later you can report out on those in a more efficient way. Let me harken back to, I guess, how I started this comment, which was Matt and I have talked over the years, and that's been extremely helpful. So, my advice would be know who your peers are and know where your support networks are, because in these kinds of work moments, you not only need to be your most professional self, but you really cannot talk about it outside of the appropriate areas. And so there's no venting about a union, like a tough negotiation meeting with anyone else who works at your institution. The super confidential nature, or I should say, not super confidential in traditional terms, but it's not appropriate to talk about outside the conversation. And so you need a peer network of people who are at other institutions who you can trust, who you can anonymize a scenario and ask for advice, whether that's about, oh boy, our HR office does or doesn't capture this employment information that I desperately need in order to produce a report on this or that. Or I lost my cool in a negotiation setting and I need advice on how to handle this better next time. Knowing who your peers are elsewhere is huge.
And I think connecting back with the systems piece that you mentioned, Jen, working with your institution as well and the folks within your institution. I'm in the graduate school, which is part of the medical school here and is part of the Mount Sinai hospital system as a greater system. We would have difficulty collecting our own information alone, and we are fairly siloed in the grand scheme of the larger institution. So making connections outside of our area to help gather information that doesn't come directly out of the graduate school was essential for being productive and being able to move things forward. I think another part of that is being willing and ready to change. The way that business was conducted before the negotiations started, even before the groups voted in unionization, you're allowed to conduct business one way. But once a union has been voted in, you are locked into your practices at those times. And then once negotiations end and you have a collective bargaining agreement in place, you're going to have a lot of new policies that need to be enacted, changed, even developed to then be enacted and changed. And you need to make sure you're having conversations with the right people about developing those policies. And then after that, disseminating these policies to the right people as well.
And like, let me just interject and say there's a
Please.
cost associated with all of that, whether that's an investment in human resources or external software that you now need to report. There's a financial ticket on everything Matt's saying.
That's really great advice. And I think a lot of folks are going to need to think about that as unionization becomes a bigger and bigger topic across institutions. And we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Matt Cipriano, Jennifer Kulbeck, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you, Ray. This is great.
Thanks.
Here's my take. The conversation with Jen and Matt really drove home how the landscape of higher education labor relations is becoming increasingly complex, yet also increasingly important to get right. What struck me most was their emphasis on the human element in these negotiations. While we often focus on contracts and agreements, at its core, a successful union relationship seems to depend on building trust and maintaining open communication, not going to that adversarial place, finding creative solutions that work for all parties. Their insights as well about data management and record keeping are particularly enlightening. It's clear that institutions need to develop robust systems and processes well before unionization efforts begin. Perhaps most importantly, though, they both highlighted how crucial it is for administrators to develop competencies in labor relations, whether they're working with established faculty unions or emerging graduate student organizations.